Well, welcome members, and welcome to our final member talk of Members Month. We want to thank you all for joining us in person, and thank you to everyone joining us online. Today we are joined by Rebecca Wilcox, Academy Postdoctoral Researcher, who will be sharing how the Academy is developing tools to directly measure the ecosystem's health and resilience. A quick reminder for folks who are joining us in person, if you have questions at the end, I will bring a microphone around so the folks online can hear your questions. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rebecca Wilcox.
Great. Thank you, Jess. Let me know if you can or cannot hear me. And again, thank you everyone for being here today and everyone online as well. I'm really excited to take this opportunity to talk to you about research that we're doing here at the Academy and also elsewhere that's taking place in the state to explore biodiversity and stability and resilience of forest ecosystems in the Sierra Nevada. And before I really start getting going, I want to say that I do not act alone. This is a collaborative effort between researchers here at the Academy as well as researchers at the U.S. Forest Service as well. And so all of us kind of come together and bring a diverse set of expertise and knowledge to help make this project what it is. And so I want to start off thinking about biodiversity and the biodiversity of the world. We have very different species all over the world, thinking about endemic and island species in Hawaii, large ungulates in the Rocky Mountain West, as well as thinking about also invertebrates and bumblebees and flowers in the landscape as well. And when we think about biodiversity, I think we often kind of jump to species richness, but I like to bring this definition up to remind us all that it's not just thinking about species themselves, but also thinking about the communities and the interactions between these species as well. When we think about how to understand health in communities and these types of ecosystems. And the fact that we're thinking about biodiversity as a whole we want to start thinking about what are ways that we can measure biodiversity and kind of capture the entities or the essence of these ecosystems and communities to better understand how to conserve them now and into the future as well. And unfortunately, as many of us know, biodiversity is under threat from environmental change, things like anthropogenic change, as well as stressors associated with climate change. And so on islands, that takes the form of invasive and exotic species coming in forest ecosystems, that can be a lot of fire coming onto the landscape. And then also, we can see situations where there's climate and there's weird precipitation and snow anomalies that can end up impacting these species. And so, again, it becomes important to how do we understand these species so that we can better protect them and conserve them under the light of all this change. And so I want to bring us a little bit closer to home and thinking about Sierra Nevada forests. And if you're like me, you've spent time in the Sierra Nevadas and maybe appreciate it, and even if you haven't been, there's lots of things that's very important for many different factors, thinking about social and cultural well-being, going for hikes in the Sierra, as well as wetland and meadow integrity, thinking about biodiversity conservation, but also thinking about things like carbon sequestration and economic diversity, as well as air quality and also water quality. I like to highlight that this map that's showing the Central Sierra is made by a water education foundation, and what it's doing is highlighting a lot of the major rivers and water resources that we all rely on as Californians. And just like biodiversity and not uniquely, Sierra Nevada forests are under threat from environmental change in terms of large fires as well as bark beetles and drought. But it's important to remember that a lot of these stressors aren't new in these ecosystems. There's things that they've evolved with, but the way in which they're happening now these days is pretty different. And so we're going to think about how the context of some of these stressors has changed. And I'm going to start out with thinking about fire, because this is something that profoundly impacts us, as well as human livelihoods, as well as infrastructure, and it's also really important for the communities as well. And so you've probably often heard that the Sierras are a fire-adapted ecosystem. And so what this means is that these systems evolve with fire. When we think about meadows, a lot of meadow maintenance is reliant on fire coming in and making sure that seedlings and trees don't encroach on these ecosystems. And then a lot of the plants and a lot of the species that live in these habitats have certain traits that allow them to persist. When we think about giant sequoias, they have really thick bark that helps to protect them from fire that comes through. And then also, one of my favorite traits is this idea of serotinous cones, where these cones are sealed tightly with the seeds inside, and fire needs to come, and I guess that helps protect them from squirrels and predators that are trying to eat the seeds. And they wait for fire to come to open them. They need hot temperatures. And so historically, fire would come into the ecosystem, kind of clear out some of the lower vegetation, the mid and moderate fuels, kills off all their little seedlings, and gets rid of some pathogens and pests, and then it kind of signals to the trees that the ground is ready for these seeds to come down and to grow. But like I said, these traits and tools evolved in a time when the forests and the fire that came through looked very different. So I like to put it in context, I guess. And so we can think about the history of fire on this landscape through a series of ethnographic interviews, as well as looking through lake sediment cores. If you dig down into lakes, you can pull them up, and it's kind of like they create these layers where you can look at years and thinking about charcoal on the landscape, as well as pollen records. And then another tool called dendrochronology, where you can actually look at fire scars on trees and use tree rings and count back in time to figure out when fires were on the landscape, what was the intensity, but also thinking about what the interval of fire on the landscape was too. And when I talk about intensity of fire, what I'm talking about is like, how hot is it? How many trees die when we think about fire there? And so going back over 5,000 years ago in the mid-Holocene, low to moderate severity fires were definitely pretty common on the landscape, and they were often started by lightning strike ignitions. And then a little bit more recently, when Native Americans and indigenous peoples started igniting fires around 4,500 years ago, as well as lightning strikes. And I like to point out a tidbit as well that how do you start to tease out whether it's a lightning strike or a human fire, which is pretty interesting. And they go into these pollen records and they can actually see that the pollen starts shifting from being pine pollen to oak pollen. So you can start to see that they're starting to manage intentionally on the landscape for cultural activities, but also for resources that are important for them as well. And then in around 1800, Euro-American settlement came. Native Americans were forcibly removed from their lands, and fire started being suppressed on the landscape. And so we enter into this time where we start to see not fire on the landscape very often, and when it does happen, it's really high in severity. And so I think it's really interesting to start to think about this in the context of how we're going to manage forests into the future. And I mean, this is a topic that's all in our minds. Just last week in the Chronicle, they had an article that was showing what all of us are probably pretty familiar with, is that through time, we've started to see fires increasing on the landscape, these really large severity fires. But before 1800, there was actually just as much fire on the landscape. But it really kind of shows or indicates that the fire was different, right? There was that low severity fire versus that high severity fire that we see now. And just to kind of illustrate what that looks like. So pre-1800s forests on the left, modern day forests on the right, and they're different in that they're less crowded. And in these modern day forests, which you've probably seen if you ever go out there, is that they have what we call ladder fuels. So there's lots of different levels of vegetation and trees that if fire comes in, it can kind of move up the ladder rungs to get into the canopy, which can be more destructive for trees. And so when fire comes into these ecosystems, we end up with situations where instead of maybe 10 or 30% of trees dying on the landscape, we have situations where it's more like 90% of trees that are dying on the landscape. And I think this picture from Yosemite is really interesting to kind of see what that looks like on the landscape, where on the left we have much more open forests, and on the right we have much more dense forests. And Yosemite and elsewhere in the Sierra Nevadas is struggling with how do we manage these forests, given that the current condition is very different than what it used to be. And this has also been in the New York Times, thinking about how, and they're talking about putting more management on the ground. How do we get more thinning, as well as prescribed burns to help manage these forests and help preserve them in this new and different state. And I think this article is really interesting because it brings up this question of how do we manage forests in the age of climate change, given that things are very different now than they used to be historically. And so when we're thinking about how to examine forests as they are now and kind of how do we conserve them, we often think about them in terms of forest health, how do we support forest health, stability, and resilience, which are all very intertwined. And so I'm going to go through each of these and kind of talk about some current science that's going on in association with them. So first off, thinking about forest health, and there's lots of different ways to think about forest health in terms of clean air and clean water, but because I'm coming at it from a biodiversity lens, we're going to focus on biodiversity and kind of a supportive, how are forests supportive of a variety of ecological processes. And like I was talking about before, we can think of this in terms of species richness as well. And the Forest Service has created these really great tools and metrics where they can start to spatially examine species richness on the landscape. So this is a map of California, of the Central Sierra, and what we're looking at is number of vertebrate species by area. So you can start to get an idea, and these are breeding populations of species, of where species are across the landscape to start to understand what is forest health and of wildlife communities look like. And then we often consider forest stability, and here there's a couple of different ways to define stability and resilience as well, but for the purpose of this, we're going to think of it as the ability to withstand species loss of a community. Say, we're working with a Sierra Mixed Conifer forest, or community, what is the likelihood that it's going to stay as that type of community, even if species are lost? And then resilience is thinking about those same kinds of issues, but does it maintain, does a forest or a habitat maintain its identity, even if a disturbance has come through as well? And so I'm going to highlight two different studies that have explored these kinds of dynamics in the Sierras that take very different approaches to do that too. So first I want to highlight some work by North and colleagues that looked at forests historically and currently to try to understand how they're different. And what they did is they went back in 1911 and resurveyed in 2011 these similar plots to look at relative stand density index of trees. So looking at the trees, and what they found, and what relative stand density index is, it's a measure of crowdedness. So if you have a lower stand density index, it's more open, it's less crowding. And if you have a higher stand density index, that means that there's more crowding. And as you can see here, we have less crowding historically and more crowding now. And this is across these three different kind of ecoregions. And so what they're suggesting is, like, using this historic and current perspective, they can see that, or they suggest that historic forest structure promoted resilience by reducing competition, which in turn supported more tree growth on these ecosystems. And so that's looking back and now, but what about looking forward? So another study by one of our colleagues, Angela White, focused on looking at habitat for 159 different vertebrate species in Lake Tahoe Basin. And what they decided to do was look into the future. So thinking about 5 different scenarios of forest management. First, thinking about suppressing. What if we just suppress? What's going to happen to the forest if we just suppress fire for the next 100 years? I think it's 80 years, 100 years. And then this idea of thinning and doing management around urban areas and outside of urban areas. And then what happens if we actually put fire on the landscape, or a fire plus model where we get lots of fire on the landscape in a controlled manner. When I say put fire on the landscape, it's in a prescribed burn way, not like an uncontrolled forest fire. And so what they did is that they looked through these 5 different scenarios. And so we've got year on the bottom, we've got min hectares on the y-axis, and we can see these different habitat types here on the right. Doesn't matter so much what they are, but you can see that things are changing through time. And what some of their take-homes were was that with low to moderate management, it doesn't really change the current trajectory of dense forests dominated by fewer trees. However, when we start getting management, mechanical and hand thinning out on the landscape, we start making forest structure that provides better outcomes in terms of reproductive habitat for wildlife. And then when there's more fire out there, it starts to create more equitable distributions of habitat. And so this really suggests that when we intervene, we can create more and diverse habitats for vertebrates out on the landscape. And so we know things about trees, we know things about different vertebrate communities. What else do we want to know that can really help us understand these forests and these communities? And yeah, what about the rest of the community, right? We've talked about vertebrates and trees, but what about herbaceous plants and invertebrates in the landscape as well? And what about these species interactions that we're coming back to from before? What about how they interact, and how might that contribute to our understanding of health, stability, and resilience on the landscape as well? And so that's where food webs come in. So food webs are a really great way to simultaneously evaluate species richness and the structure and complexity of interactions. So here's an example food web. On the right, each circle is a species, and each line is representing an interaction or a link between these species. And so the size of the circle indicates the importance of that species in the web, so importance being more connections in these webs. And so we want to use this and we want to ask the question, can our understanding of communities using a food web perspective advance our knowledge of how species interactions might contribute to these critical processes? And a reminder of what food webs look like. At the bottom, we start with primary producers, and then we go up the chain, we think about primary consumers, so this herbivorous beetle consuming some of this foliage, and then moving up, a sooty grouse that might be eating opportunistically foraging on these herbivore or on these primary consumers, these beetles, and then a fox, a tertiary consumer that is consuming, so thinking about the different levels as we move up the chain, and then of course the apex predators on top. And using food webs, you can ask a lot of different questions, and they have in different realms in ecology. And research done here by Dr. Peter Rupnerine, if you've seen some previous member talks, he's given some really good lectures, and I urge you to check some of those out. But he's done a lot of different work, and notably looking at paleo food webs, but also comparing them to modern food webs as well, to start to understand how we can use them as tools, thinking about ancient food webs and modern ones, in terms of how can we use them as tools to understand and conserve these communities or these food webs. For the rest of the talk, what I want to do is explore variation in food web biodiversity and structure in different forest communities in the Lake Tahoe Basin. And these are going to be some preliminary results that I'm excited to share with you all. And then we're going to talk about next steps associated with these results and this project in general, and then kind of scale out to the big picture as well. So evaluating biodiversity and structure across habitats is important for a number of reasons. First, it can be important for prioritizing conservation areas. When we start thinking about what we value, where on the landscape, where do we need to put action to help promote different species or different communities, or where do we not? This is important when we're thinking about refugia habitats in terms of climate change, but also thinking about corridors on the landscape too. So corridors being connections between different habitats and populations, and this can be really important for genetic connectivity and maintaining populations in the landscape as well. It's also important for identifying the processes that cause these patterns in diversity and structure to arise on the landscape. Why do we see these patterns? And this can also help us with that, locating what's happening on the landscape and why. We can also start to explore links between some of the metrics that I'm going to go over, between these metrics and also food web stability on the landscape. And then also this can help us set up predictions for what systems might be most resilient to different disturbances in the future. So there's many different ways to measure biodiversity. I'm going to focus on a few that we're going to go through today. First, thinking of species richness. So each dot here is a species, and how species richness can contribute to stability of food webs can be variable, and it really highlights the fact that species richness is important depending on what species you have, which we'll get into a little bit later. We can take these species and put them into these larger circles, or what we call guilds. We often group species based on functional traits, or their functional traits, common characteristics, habits. Think of these guilds as like pollinators. Could be multiple species, multiple hummingbird species within a certain guild, or small mammals in another type of guild. And so that helps us start to think about, okay, we have species, but what kind of functions are they having on the landscape? What's the diversity of functions that we have on the landscape? But then also thinking about functional groups, we want to start thinking about how much redundancy do we have within these functional groups. So if you have a community that just has one small mammal versus a community that has 4 different species of small mammals, it's going to be more important if you lose that one species in that one community, because then all your small mammals are gone. But if you have more species, that might be more robust to species change and things like that. So thinking about functional redundancy, how many species per guild are there? And then, even though we have these species, the next step is using that food web, right? So starting to think about how does their position in the food web, how does their linkage impact these food webs and how we describe these communities. And it's really great because we can lean on network analyses. These are analyses that have been used a lot in social networking, thinking about Facebook, as well as across ecological literature as well. So there's lots of different metrics that you can use, and I'm going to talk about just a few of them today. Again, the circles are species, and the lines are representing interactions between species. So down at the bottom, the green ones, primary producers, and then we have primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary, and then the apex predators again, like we did before. And so the first metric that I'm going to talk about is network trophic position. And what this does is that it describes the number of trophic levels. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are present in a network. And we do this by looking at how connected these different species are. What is the average length between this purple species in the middle and the bottom? And so that gives us a more descriptive metric of where these animals are in the food web. And given these different trophic positions, we can start to make, and based on the literature, we can start to make predictions associated about stability and what stable food webs look like. So if each of these lines represents a different food web, the food webs in red that are longer and have more chains or have apex predators and things like that can often be susceptible or maybe not as stable as these shorter food webs, because higher species that are higher up are often are more susceptible to removal, which can have ramifications throughout the food web. So we can start to think about stability in terms of the distribution, and that being, we can go through for each of these species and estimate their trophic network position. And then secondly, we think about chain length, which is also a similar way to start to think about what is the structure of the interactions that you have in a food web. So for this, it's the longest path that each species is a part of. So back to this purple one, we can see that its chain is 2 long. We go to primary consumers and then down to primary producers. If we look at this apex predator, it's 5 chains long. So we can start to get an idea of what is the size of our food webs as well. And following a similar logic before, we have these 2 different food webs, one in orange and one in red. Food webs that have longer chain links are potentially less stable than those that have shorter chain links as well. So Lake Tahoe Basin is where we'll start exploring some of these dynamics. It's a really special place. It's bounded by the Carson Range and the Sierra Crest, and it's where the California and Great Basin forested provinces meet. And that, along with having a very steep elevational gradient, means there's a lot of cool different habitats going on, a lot of species richness in this very small space. And so it's a great place to start looking at these dynamics. So in the Lake Tahoe Basin, we're going to ask these 2 questions. Does biodiversity vary across habitat types in the Lake Tahoe Basin? And does food web structure vary across different habitat types in the Lake Tahoe Basin too? So we're going to be looking at 8 different habitat types: Sierra mixed conifer, Jeffrey pine forest, white fir forest, red fir forest, montane chaparral, which is our only non-tree dominated habitat type, aspen, subalpine fir, and lodgepole pine. And so that's our tree communities, our habitat types. But what about the species, the other species that come along with those different habitat types as well? And so we have over 1,800 species included in our food webs, and these are vertebrates. These are terrestrial food webs that we're working on right now in these habitat types. So vertebrates being birds, mammals, and reptiles. Over 1,200 species of plants, herbaceous plants. In woody trees and shrubs and all of those things, and then invertebrates as well. And so with this big species list, based on, we can start to group them into those functional groups. These raptors go together, these small mammals go together, based on what are common predators and prey that they have, as well as habits. Are they nocturnal? Are they diurnal? What kind of habitats are they inhabiting as well? And so we end up with a certain number of fields on the landscape as well. And so to put this in our dot format, we've got our different species, each being a different dot, and then we put them into these guilds, so into these different functional groups. And then based on a lot of literature review, we start to create links between these different guilds, and this helps us create what's called a meta-network. So we end up with a meta-network, so this is a map of the Lake Tahoe Basin and all of the different habitat types in it. And so we end up with this global meta-network that describes potential interactions for these 1,800 species. But the thing is, we want to know what's happening in these specific habitat types. So what we do is we'll pick out a habitat that we want to focus on, and then based on a certain number of habitat features, habitat suitability, elevation, shade tolerance, lots of different traits, we use that to start and make a subset for what is the potential sub-meta network, or the habitat-specific meta network that could be in these different habitats. And because species interactions can be variable across space and time, and it's hard to kind of pinpoint interactions on a given day, what we do is we take this habitat-specific meta network and we start to simulate it multiple times and start to estimate what are potential species-level food webs that could be made from this combination of species and their interactions. And we can replicate this across all of our different forest habitat types. So again, with this map showing the different habitat types, and one thing about, if you spent time in Lake Tahoe, that steep elevational gradient, if you start moving up one of the ridges in the basement, you'll start in the Sierra Mix conifer, you'll transition maybe you'll stay in Sierra Mix conifer for a while, or you could transition to Jeffrey pine, then white fir, and so on, up into the higher elevations, where you start seeing subalpine fir and lodgepole pine. And so what we did is to examine just a subset of these potential habitats on the landscape. We looked at habitats, we sampled food webs at 3 of these habitat types at low elevation, 3 at mid elevation, and then 3 at high elevation as well. And so what this looks like, again, is for each of our habitat types, or for each elevational zone, we looked at 3 different vegetation types and created food webs for these vegetation types at this elevation. So Sierra Mix conifer, Jeffrey pine, and white fir at low elevation, and then so on at medium and high. And the one confusing thing about this is that potentially confusing thing is that Sierra Mix conifer is in there twice, and that's because it has such a long elevational range. So we looked at it in both the low elevation and the mid elevation. So first off, starting to think about species richness on the landscape. On the x-axis, we have our different habitat types in these different elevational bins. And then we have species richness on the y-axis, which is the count of species. We have the number of plants in dark blue, and then lighter blue invertebrates, and even lighter blue vertebrates. And so we can start to pick out some patterns that we start to see on the landscape. We see that species richness declines with elevation, but you can also start to see some different patterns that are happening. Okay, we won't use a pointer, but some different changes that are happening within these elevational bands as well. So at low elevation, Jeffrey pine forest has pretty high species richness compared to the other 2 habitat types in low elevation. And as we move forward, you can see that montane chaparral and aspen appear to have lower species richness than the other habitat types as well. So some within elevation patterns happening as well. And now shifting over to thinking about gild richness. So the x-axis is still the same, but now we've got looking at gild richness on the y-axis. And the gradient of colors is similar as well. And so here we see that same pattern where gild richness is decreasing, but maybe less steeply than we saw before. And we also see some habitat specific patterns kind of changing as well. So looking back on that low elevation, Jeffrey pine doesn't have as high of gild richness as white fir and Sierra Mix conifer. We see a little bit of a switch happening there. And then if we go back over to montane chaparral and to aspen, they're actually higher than subalpine fir when we start thinking about the number of functional groups in these habitats. So starting to see a little bit of mismatch between our metrics that we have here. But then lastly, in terms of biodiversity metrics, thinking about redundancy. So this is the number of species per guild, habitats on the bottom again, and then redundancy. So if a dot or a shape falls on the 1 line, that means that there's 1 species per guild. And so the higher up from the line that a dot is, that means it's got more redundancy within that guild, or average redundancy in that guild. And so some of the patterns that we see first are that there's high redundancy in plants in our plant guilds, all of our triangles. And that makes sense actually because of how we made these guilds. We created our guilds based on common predator and prey interactions, as well as reproductive life forms, thinking about do they produce cones or acorns or berries or seeds. And so there were less guilds because we're just thinking about predatory interactions. We don't take into account what are plants eating on the landscape too. So that's an artifact of how we're doing it, but it's also really great too. I mean, it's good to see that there's lots of redundancy in terms of our plant communities. But then when we start looking at invertebrates and vertebrates, we see this decline with elevation as well as variation between our habitat types as well. And so maybe the fact that things are low too could be that is there a specific group or functional group that we're really interested in? We should dive into these patterns a little bit more to explore which groups might be at most at risk, because invertebrates are declining in a lot of parts of the world, so maybe we would be worried if certain functional groups are leaving the system, and similarly with vertebrates as well. So now shifting over to some of our network metrics. So we've described our species, but now let's think about the structure of this food web. So starting out, we'll think about trophic position, network trophic position, which again is thinking about how many levels are in your food web. And in our low, medium, high elevations, and at low elevations, so these graphs, and they're positioned in this way to think about trophic levels. So they're flipped up on the side, and so we've got proportion of species on the x-axis, and then the network trophic position on the y-axis. So moving up from those herbivores up to those apex predators in this vertical space. And so for our 3 different habitat types. And looking across these other habitat types as well, a couple of trends to point out that we see here is that more trophic levels, there tend to be more trophic levels at lower elevations where we're reaching the upper 5 and above. So maybe they're a little bit potentially less stable than these ones that have a shorter number of trophic levels. And then we also start to see maybe some patterns poking out. One thing about trophic position is kind of the 3 to 4 range is kind of the middle of your food web. It's kind of where there's a lot of interactions. This is where the omnivores are. This is where species that have a lot of links and have high connectivity are. So it's like having a kind of rounded middle section is good when we think about food webs, and it's more stable when we think about food webs. And so in the middle here, red fir forest, montane chaparral, as well as lodgepole pine, we start to see some kind of bumps and some maybe potentially more stable food webs in these systems. Now shifting over to chain links. So that's thinking about the number of links from the top of the food web down to the bottom. And here the axis has been flipped. So now we have chain link down on the x-axis and then the proportion of species on the y-axis. And we can look at these different trends across our different habitat types. And again, similar to what we saw in the past graphs, we have longer chain links, we have longer food webs at these low and mid elevations, and shorter chain links at high elevations, suggesting that there might be more food web stability at in these habitats at these higher elevations. And to summarize this, what we've just gone over with all of these metrics I've thrown at you, thinking about biodiversity and does it vary across habitat types, we saw that species richness, guild richness, and redundancy is generally decreasing with elevation, but we also saw mismatches between which habitats had the highest and lowest values, suggesting that it might be important to delve into some of these dynamics a little bit further. And then when we looked at food web structural metrics, we started seeing higher level trophic positions and longer chains for food webs at mid and lower elevations. But we also saw that certain food webs, certain habitat types, food webs appear to have potentially higher stability than others in the system as well. And when we're thinking about stability, and here we have these theorized ideas of what stability could look like in these food webs, we want to start testing it, but we also want to think about what is stability, and is it always the goal when we're thinking about food webs and how we manage communities. And so, for example, if you start out with something like montane chaparral, this was one of our habitats that could be pretty stable and has been shown to be stable in other types of literature as well. Through time, it might be good in the fact that if you have fire that comes onto the landscape, it's more likely to stay montane chaparral. Don't need to manage it very much, and it just stays montane chaparral through time. However, stability could be a bit of a problem when you start out with something like the Sierra mixed conifer forest. A fire comes in, maybe it transitions to montane chaparral, but because montane chaparral is so stable, it might be hard to get it back to Sierra mixed conifer so it stays montane chaparral. So when we have these ideas of what are stable food webs, we want to start thinking about that in the context, giving it a context of the other habitats in the area, and thinking about in the context of the landscape as well, and what our research objectives and our management and our conservation objectives are. So now that we know something more about these different food webs and starting to know a little bit about what variation looks like in our different habitat types, the next step is really testing wildlife community resilience. So taking these and starting to explore resilience, their ability to return these food web communities, and are they resilient to changes in species composition as well as responses to disturbances as well. And so we can start to ask some questions. And I guess another way to put it is we can, now that we have these food webs, we can start to poke them and start to remove species and start to think about what happens when you remove or do different things with these food webs. And so what happens when species are lost? There's different studies. This one has been done in Michigan that looked at a much simpler food chain here. We've got swamp sparrows on the bottom, we've got raccoons in the middle, and then coyotes on the top. And they looked at food webs that had coyotes and that didn't, and that what they found was that when coyotes were absent, raccoons did really well, and song sparrows didn't do so well. It had lower nest success. So we can start to think about what happens to our systems and our species when different species are lost. And this is important in the Sierras because we have some of our carnivores are at risk, fishers and martens. So adorable, but they're also sensitive species in our habitats. And so we can start to, how can we use food webs and our understanding of their roles in these different communities to start to quantify what would their absence look like in these food webs. And then, so we've talked about species absences, but what about species additions? So given that we're in a museum, so highlighting some really cool work that was actually done at a museum across the bay over at Berkeley. Joseph Grinnell and the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology went and surveyed vertebrates across California at a couple different sites in addition to these three highlighted here in 1911 through about 1929. And then they resurveyed again in the 2000s. And what Morgan Tingley and colleagues did was that they looked at birds and they looked at, are their elevational ranges shifting from when we looked at them 80 years ago? And so here these graphs on the left are in these three different habitat types or these three different regions. And what we're looking at is, did the lower limit of the elevational range shift up, or did the lower limit, did the lower limit and the upper limit shift up? And what they found was that in the Lassen and Yosemite ranges, that these birds' elevational ranges are moving up in elevation associated with climate change. And so what happens when we have these systems where we have novel species interactions, where we have different species than we've had historically mixing, and what does that mean for our communities and our food webs? And then birds aren't the only thing that's being predicted to shift. Entire habitats are being predicted to shift when associated with climate change. So looking back at the study that we had before, one of the things is that if we don't, Sierra conifer is going higher, all of the vegetation types are getting higher, and what that means is that for the higher vegetation types, they start to get compacted. And so we can start to ask, okay, if we really care about a certain habitat type or a certain food web community, how can we help manage it to promote resilience in that community or that food web community as well? So one example that we think about is red fir forest. And so we can start to look at that food web, and with our food webs, we want to start saying, what happens if we just don't do anything? What does the food web look like after that? What happens if we do some thinning and some management? What does the food web look like after that? Or if we have prescribed burns, what's happening in those types of systems too? So that we can start to understand in these given scenarios which type of food web might be most resilient or most likely to return to red fir forest after bark beetles or temperature, climate change or fire and things like that. So some really fun and exciting steps ahead of how we can start to think about food webs and communities and how that contributes to these different metrics that I've been talking about. And so to end, I kind of just want to scale back out, and I've been talking about biodiversity and food webs for a lot of this talk, but it really is just one thing, right? When we think about how we manage these ecosystems, there's a lot of other interests at play in these different systems. And since coming back and working in these systems again, it's been really refreshing to see how many collaborative efforts there are in the Sierras in terms of research, kind of at these watershed levels, and there's regional levels. There's homeowners coming together, nonprofit organizations, state and federal agencies that come and create these collaborative regional planning groups. And one such regional planning group is the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, which one of our collaborators is one of the main folks on. And this is a 2.4 million hectare area spanning multiple different regions. And what they've done, this collaborative group has done, is they've come together, all of these different interest groups, and they've created these 10 pillars of resilience. So starting to think about what are the conversations that we want to have and what kind of issues are coming to the table when we start to think about how to manage these forests into the future, thinking about air quality, water security, wetland integrity, biodiversity, forest resilience, carbon sequestration, fire dynamics, fire adapted communities, economic diversity, and social and cultural well-being. So it's very cool to see all of these different interests at the table being considered, and how do we kind of use this information to help us plan and prioritize conservation efforts and management efforts in these forests into the future. So moving forward from our project's perspective and what I do day to day, I'm continuing to work on developing metrics to evaluate wildlife communities' health and resilience, developing these metrics, also exploring more metrics that we've seen here, and then also trying to think about, now that we have these food webs, how can we start perturbing them and thinking about what happens to these food webs when there's different disturbances or species loss into different additions as well. And then also thinking about what we're hoping to do with this effort as well is kind of hopefully highlighting the value as food webs as a tool to simultaneously evaluate community health, stability, and resilience of these communities, or of these and wildlife communities, and maybe in the process highlighting biodiversity and its impact or importance in these systems. And ultimately, the goal is to help contribute to management and conservation of Sierra Nevada wildlife communities as a whole. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators again, both here at the Academy and at the Forest Service, our funding agency. Happy to chat with anybody if they want to send me an email. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Any questions? I can hand off the mic.
Science evolves, and we try to coordinate a lot more data than we ever used to, and we take a systems approach, and it's not very conducive to our political system. A lot of people don't want to deal with the complexity, and so there's always the challenge of how does science pull everything together and present, the major conclusions to our political systems and funders.
Start with an easy question here.
Oh no, there's a hard limit.
So wait, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, but let's answer that.
Oh, okay. I mean, it's right, life is complex, ecology is complex, everything is complex. And I think one thing that Food Webs tries to do as a tool is kind of distill that, and what we're trying to do with these metrics is kind of distill it into something of how can we represent these communities in a more simplified way, which there's always going to be nuances, right? But it's just like, how can we use a metric or a combination of metrics to give a better idea of how we understand food webs and these communities in Sierras? But yeah, I can't answer the question more than that too. It's things to think about too. Thank you. Part two.
The harder question. you know, thank goodness we have the Grinnell studies from 1911 as kind of a baseline. And, you know, one of the questions when we were looking at what was happening in 2011 was, okay, will the species be able to relocate fast enough compared to the speed of climate change? And I didn't know if there was an update on that. But the other thing is that now that we're realizing that we've been we've been thinking that there's a lot more water in our region than we ever thought there was, you know, a lot less. Now that we're in a long-term drought, what do we use for a baseline?
Yeah, I think you've been working in the system, it sounds like, a little bit, and it's thinking about the history, right? And we have very novel conditions now. We can use history to a certain extent, right, to think about how things have changed, but how things are going to change into the future is a whole nother question, right? Because drought is becoming more severe on the landscape, as well as thinking about these different extreme weather events that can happen. Like, there's a lot of uncertainty moving forward. And I think that that's one of the big challenges, is how do we account for that uncertainty, or try to account for that uncertainty? Definitely. Thank you.
You know, we were talking about thinning the forests. Well, the beagles are doing some of the forests, you know, ways we can really anticipate. Are there any talk with the various kinds of logging businesses about going in and doing careful thinning out? You know, don't make as much money because you can't get as much out of there as fast. But also cleaning up after themselves and not leaving everything there to burn as soon as it dries out.
Yeah, logging dynamics and practices they're very interesting. I mean, California is special in that there's some of the most, there's very stringent practices that are in place, but I think that some of the dynamics are changing about what's important when we manage these forests. There's more money in the state to do thinning that may not be for a profit, that they can go in and start to remove trees to help kind of promote that structure, that pre-1800 structure that we might have seen before, without necessarily making money because it's coming in from a different route. But yeah, you're exactly right. How do we promote practices, and that's not my realm per se, but how do we help support different practices that might support healthy forests and what that looks like? Thank you.
So in the communities you show, they're all forested, or with the exception of chaparral, but how do meadows fit into that?
Great question. So I did kind of talk about meadows before. So meadows are super important, and the thing about, kind of harkening back to your question before, is that a lot of our models are tree-based, and they don't take meadows into account for various reasons. So we're very tree-based, but I completely agree with you that integrating more understanding of meadows is important for cultural reasons, traditional reasons, as well as thinking about fire moving on the landscape. Meadows can act as a natural buffer, and meadow ecosystems are very biodiverse. So that's something that I want to add and incorporate into our different habitat types, definitely. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm over. You know, we're the problem. You know, we're just looking at species. If you look at what was around mid-1800s, with the populations like now, and where we are, and what we take for granted about what we can do to where we are.
Yeah.
I mean, we're the biggest part of the problem. So how are we gonna fix that one? Not about politics, but
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, I think we all did move.
Or be more intentional about what we do and how we do it,
Yeah.
definitely. But it is very
A lot more.
different, kind of thinking about, it's the history of what we've seen in the past is very different than what we're dealing with now. Thank you for that comment.
We'll all move to a higher elevation.
I think the birds are doing it.
Another thing, my question is the birds that are moving to a higher elevation, does something shift when they actually get to the top and start making it down the other side? That was part of the talk when I was in Costa Rica, is that the birds kind of went over the top and then started eating insects on the other side of the mountain, and it was really messing everything up. So how does that play out in Tahoe if they get really further up the peaks?
Yeah, great question. I don't know specifically. But I think that what you're bringing up, or this idea that these novel species are kind of flowing over onto the other side, we're starting to see these really novel communities. And what does that mean for these communities that might have been, like, what if you're species that are already set up in quote unquote refugia habitat, climate refugia, and now you've got all these other species coming in, so what are those communities start to look like? And is there more competition? What are kind of the dynamics that are happening in the system? So definitely interesting to explore. Thanks.
Kind of a follow-up to that, aren't certain species or communities almost on a trajectory for extinction as they get forced higher up? For instance, where is it pika or pika?
I say pika.
Pika, that's what I've heard both. Isn't, someone else said, it is similar lecture, I asked about that, she said, oh, it's gone. You know, and I wonder, that would be terrible. But there they are, they're about as high and timber-free as they can go.
Mm-hmm.
And if other things are moving in,
Yeah.
does the habitat just change, or are some of them just going to disappear? Or do?
I think that's a big question, right? Of just like oftentimes we think of these habitat patches as islands on top of mountain types because they really are isolated, these high communities, and how do they reach other mountain type tops to think about connectivity in these populations. And so I think there's a lot of alpine science researchers who are looking at that exact question, thinking about how are these kinds of suitable habitat ranges shrinking for these kind of obligate high elevation species. So yeah, definitely. Thanks for that comment.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you, members.